In a recent piece, Dr. Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, explored an untold story of the Middle East, one that counters the typical message that when the U.S. leaves, chaos ensues. Dr. Parsi highlighted a recent summit hosted by the Iraqi government where Saudi, Iranian, and Emirati foreign ministers came together, emphasizing that as the United States steps back militarily, regional states were compelled to step forward diplomatically. Dr. Parsi, welcome. Fascinating piece that you wrote. Tell us more about this, because I think there's thought that, of course, when the U.S. leaves, things fall apart. But you allude to there's a lot of room for diplomacy, and I think you hit on something very important.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I mean, the almost unquestionable idea in Washington is that we are there because we create calm and stability, and if we leave, chaos invariably will ensue. And we're now seeing quite a lot of evidence to the contrary. Not to say that things will not be difficult in the Middle East, it will be. But in the last 2.5 years, as it's become increasingly clear to many of the actors in the region that the United States is serious about reducing its military footprint in the region, it is serious about not getting dragged into more wars in the region, we have seen how the incentive structures of all of the actors in the region have started to change. Diplomacy between themselves, which before were kind of unattractive because diplomacy would entail all kinds of costly compromises, now has become much more attractive to all of them because the option of hiding behind American military power no longer exists. And lo and behold, the region itself, without the involvement of the United States, puts together these regional security summits, manages to get the Iranians and the Emiratis and the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, all of them to show up, have a dialogue. Again, don't want to overstate it. We don't know where it will lead to, but it shows that the region has full capacity of pursuing these options on their own, as long as we don't incentivize them not to by dominating the region militarily.
Now, what were the main issues hashed out at this summit?
Well, there's not any clarity yet of exactly what the outcome was in terms of deciding. The mere fact that they were on the stage there together, the mere fact that the secret dialogue between the Saudis and the Iranians that have been taking place in Iraq for the last year is now fully in the open, is in and of itself quite a breakthrough. Now comes the harder part of making sure that there's changes on the substance. And the Saudis and the Iranians are continuing to talk thanks to the mediation of the Iraqis. And the core issue right now is, of course, Yemen, in which the Saudis are looking for a way out of that war. And they're hoping to be able to get something from the Iranians in terms of pressure on the Houthis in order to make sure that a Saudi exit can be made possible.
Well, and what's interesting is, the U.S.'s continued presence in Iraq is largely based around the Defeat ISIS mission between Iraq and Syria, as well as our Train, Advise, and Equip mission with the Iraqi security forces. And I would imagine if you have the Iranians being willing to partner with the Iraqis in this capacity, they could also work together on themselves defeating ISIS, a joint enemy of both the Iraqis and the Iranians. Do you think that's something that may have come up in this summit?
Absolutely. Counterterrorism was something that all of them share an interest in. Of course, unfortunately, many of them support non-state actors that are working against the others. So they need to really get out of the business of using these type of proxies. But you mentioned ISIS, and I think it's important to note that the first country that actually started sending in military aid and military forces into Iraq in order to prevent ISIS from actually taking Baghdad were the Iranians. They have their own reasons to do so. Has nothing to do with the United States. So I think without a doubt, there is enough incentives for them to collaborate on those fronts and to defeat ISIS. Moreover, we also have to keep in mind that our own war on terror has really far been from a success. We saw that just a couple of weeks ago with a drone strike in Kabul, in which we unfortunately killed an American aid worker and 6 children from his family, not an ISIS terrorist. So we unfortunately we have to be honest about the fact that a lot of these killings that we have done aiming at terrorists have actually led to more terrorists popping up, because a lot of much of the recruitment of the Taliban, for instance, has been to go to families who had family members killed by American forces, and as a result of that, managed to rebuild the Taliban 10 or so years ago. So we have to really recognize that fighting terrorism, as important as it is, does not have to be done the manner that we have done it so far, because it's not been effective.
What kind of U.S. presence do we still have in Iraq, and what's it going to take to reduce that footprint?
So there's roughly 2,500 troops there. They're mostly focusing on training and equipping. But the problem is that even though such a mission actually could in and of itself not be problematic under more normal circumstances, the problem is that as long as U.S. forces are in Iraq, the U.S. and Iran are going to fight some form of a proxy conflict with each other on Iraqi soil. That's part of the reason why the Iraqi parliament voted last year or 2 years ago to have the invitation to U.S. forces to essentially be cut short and that they should be leaving. And there are other elements in Iraq who don't want to see the U.S. leave. The bottom line is, as long as the U.S. is there, it actually it becomes a source of tension that can create much bigger problems than the ones that we're trying to solve. And it can also drag the United States into a direct conflict with the Iranians.
Well, and it barely went noticed, actually. I believe it was on the anniversary of September 11th that there was an Iranian drone strike within Iraq that was aimed at positions held by U.S. forces. And luckily, no fatalities or casualties involved. But very much so, this becomes something where the mere presence of U.S. forces sort of encourages this ongoing conflict with Iran. What I'm going to be curious to see, and I'd be very curious your perspective, is, you know, President Biden, when he was speaking at the UN General Assembly this week, talked about how this was the first time in 20 years that the U.S. has not been at war. And it was almost like he was pretending that we're not currently in a conflict in Iraq, by the way, authorized, I believe, by the same AUMF we use to authorize our war in Afghanistan. To me, it alluded to the fact that I would think the Biden administration may be looking at next drawing down our force presence in Iraq. Do you see this as something, is that what you think is on the table ahead? And if so, does it have anything to do with the decision by Biden to re-engage in the Iran nuclear deal? Could that potentially be a bargaining chip?
I'm not so sure that the nuclear deal will be a bargaining chip. I think the nuclear deal, more than anything else, will perhaps be one of the most important elements needed in order for the U.S. to have a full withdrawal. If the nuclear deal is not resolved and the U.S. and Iran are going to be at each other's throats over the nuclear question, then it's going to be much more difficult for the United States to reduce its military footprint in the region. But the Iraq question, I think, is very important, and I'm glad you raised it. I think that is the next likely withdrawal. It's going to be very different from what we saw in Afghanistan, of course. There's already a negotiating process for some sort of a drawdown taking place, although the time for that has not been set. But I think it's going to be easier to make a withdrawal from Iraq than it will be to do so from Syria. The difference, of course, is that when it comes to Syria, there is no congressional authority for it whatsoever. So it's in many ways more illegal than what's happening in Iraq in terms that in the Iraqi case, the Iraqi government asked the U.S. to come in and help defeat ISIS.
Right. Fascinating stuff, Dr. Parsi. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.